everybody, I hope you are doing well. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Mpho. I'm a CA and I like to chat all things business, careers, properties, a lot of things. Today we're having a business discussion and we haven't had one of this in a long time. We are talking Elon Musk, we're talking Twitter, and we're talking everything that's happening in the world of billionaires that some of us are honestly just props to, okay? So if you haven't heard, Elon Musk wants to buy Twitter for $44 billion. That is a lot of money. So he basically wants to take Twitter from a public company that it is and privatize it. Now the transaction is still very much subject to statutory, regulatory, and shareholder approval, but essentially it has been approved by directors of Twitter. That's what I wanted to chat about in this video, specifically focusing on three things, right? I want to focus on why Elon Musk wants to buy Twitter. Why can't he just let it be? Why is he bothered by it? Secondly, I want to chat about the funding of the transaction, how it's been funded, how money will be raised. And then thirdly, we want to chat about some of the next steps. So now that the board of directors of Twitter have considered the transaction and for their part have approved it, what does this mean now? How do we go forward? How do we go on from this? If you think you could be interested in this video, do stick around and let me know your thoughts in the comment section. You know, what are your feelings on this? Are you bothered or not? Let me know in the comment section. Okay, cool. The first part of this video, why buy Twitter? And I'm going to specifically reference to the reasons that Elon Musk himself has provided. There's three reasons that I want to look at. The first one is freedom of speech, or the lack thereof, according to him. Now, Musk believes that there's a lot of censorship and moderation that's happening in Twitter and no one understands how. He believes that Twitter is very much pro-left. So things that are considered to be far-right and the likes, think Donald Trump, unsupported or actually basically censored in the platform. Now, in a world where diverse people exist, Elon Musk believes that even in Twitter, we should be seeing this diverse thoughts and diverse being encouraged. A lot of us, when thinking freedom of speech, we ask ourselves whether the question is whether everybody should say whatever they want to say and no consequences for that. And he's also addressed that in saying freedom of speech, provided that people are compliant with laws of whatever country that they are from. What is happening now, and this is according to him, is that Twitter is even more stricter than what you would have countries being comfortable with. Some things aren't wrong, some things aren't illegal, but then they end up being censored in the Twitter sphere. I don't know, what do you think? Let me know as we go along what your thoughts are. Do you think there's a lot of moderation, or do you think he just wants to say whatever he wants to say and no consequences for it? Let me know. If he just wants Trump back, I think he can lobby and just get Trump back. I don't know, let me know. The second reason that he wants to buy Twitter is that he believes the algorithm should be open source. Now, for those of us who aren't sure what open source is, so basically when a software is open source, it means that everyone is able to access it and everyone can make changes to the code, specifically in this case to the algorithm of Twitter. He says that if Twitter is this big platform that informs our thoughts for the most part, that influences our thoughts for the most part, then we should know what it promotes and what it demotes. I agree with that personally. I do agree that, you know, if you are living in a community or in a society and, you know, so sort of similar to how we have social contracts in the real world, you sort of feel like you need to know what this Twitter sphere where we are all existing in socially, well, not all of us, because Twitter is quite small in comparison to the likes of Facebook. But, you know, if it's shaping politics, if it's shaping somewhat societies, then we all need to know how it's doing that. We all need to know what it's censoring. We all need to know how it promotes what it promotes. And we all sort of need to be aligned with that, right? And again, no one is forcing us to use Twitter. If you want to use Twitter, you sign up for it and you use it. I think, though, that it has grown in such a way that we do need to be a little bit more responsible with how lives are conducted on Twitter and basically how those softwares and that tech behind it is operating. And honestly, there are some sites or softwares that are open source. I think VLC and I think also WordPress is open source. So it's not like it's never done before. It's not like it'll be starting with Twitter. We do have some softwares, rather big ones at that, that are open source, it's not entirely far-fetched to expect the algorithm of Twitter to be open source as well. Twitter is not the biggest of social media networks or platforms that we have out there. I mean, if you consider that in South Africa, about 9 million or so of us use Twitter versus 27 million using Facebook. Or globally, there's about 206 million users of Twitter versus 2.9 billion of Facebook. Facebook is much bigger, and maybe, but again, it's a matter of you can't really acquire Facebook because it is that much bigger. And then the third point that Elon Musk raised as his reason, and some of these reasons, by the way, we're finding on Twitter because that's his primary means of communication. But I actually think he said this in his TED talk, the TED event that they had recently, was that beyond a certain number of followers, Twitter users shouldn't be anonymous. And I 100% agree with that. If you think of some of the careers that have been ended on Twitter, some of the misinformation that's been published now with COVID and everything, I feel like, we shouldn't allow people to exist, especially because Twitter then affects the decisions that are made on a daily. I was actually watching the Senzo Meyiwa documentary, and to think that the tweets that were pushed by Not Beru were used in helping real law enforcement workers to actually work on the case. You can't have such big implications by fingers that we know we can't put a name to. So beyond a certain level, I do agree that users should not be anonymous at all. The lives impacted, the livelihoods lost. It's just, given how we've allowed for Twitter to transcend the social space and to now be a part of how we live our lives and make decisions in the real world, yeah, we need accountability, and we need to know who's behind what account, especially if it is a prominent account. So now let's look at how the deal is being funded. I've put together sort of like a high level term sheet, not really. And if you look at how the monies will come together, we've got about 13 million in leverage buyout type of debt, and this will consist of senior debt loans, revolving cash facilities, and then bridging loans. And then we've got a margin facility of 12.5 million. So the 13 million and the 12.5 will be issued by banks, and then Elon Musk will come up with his own equity, and he's already said that he's confirmed equity for about $21 billion US. Now let's look at each one of them one by one, starting with the leverage buyout debt. So I saw an article by Bloomberg, and according to them, the LBO debt is pretty tight with limited conditions. They've reported that banks would only be able to get out of this deal if Elon Musk also is able to get out of it as well. So it's pretty tight, because I actually thought, we'd be looking at a lot of salient terms and conditions that must still be met for the funders to be comfortable with the loan, especially because banks' money is people's money, so they must have shown that they've satisfied their credit requirements, and it's not just throwing money out of the window. But according to Bloomberg, the funding is pretty tight with limited conditions, and we'll see probably towards the end of this week or even next week what that looks like when they release the detailed major acquisitions terms and conditions. And then the margin facility of 12.5 million, this will be against Tesla's stock. And to explain what this means for those of us who aren't finance professionals, essentially a margin facility is a facility that is provided to you, secured by other shares that you hold. In this case, they've given this loan to Elon Musk, and the security for it's on the back of Tesla shares that he owns. Now, the terms of the margin loan, it starts at a 25% LTV. Apparently, I saw somewhere on Twitter. Twitter is helping us with this news. I actually can't remember exactly where I got this information, but it's 25% LTV loan to value. And Tesla shares can fall to $740 a share before there's a breach of this facility, or before Elon Musk needs to put in some cash. And if you consider the volatility of Tesla shares, where Elon Musk puts out a tweet and the shares are down 10%, the share price is down 10%, I don't know how much room he's got, but I mean, it's one of the biggest companies of our time, most valuable companies of our time. So, I mean, let's see what happens there. And then the last bit of the funding that we can look at is his own equity contribution. Now, as mentioned, he has said that he's secured 21 billion as potential equity contribution. And how he will potentially raise this is by selling his Tesla shares. Another person or another question that many people would have is that why would he need the margin loan and not just sell his Tesla shares and pay for and replace that loan? Why would he want to pay interest on that? And reality is that in this case, when he uses the margin loan or the margin facility, he's able to access value out of his Tesla shares without actually having to sell those shares and pay capital gains taxes and things like that from the sale of those shares. So now he's getting the money without having to pay taxes. And I know bankers are just quite smart. Okay, so that's the reason. And then with the remaining part of it, that's when he will sell his shares for however much he needs, and then he will pay that in as equity. Another consideration, actually, in his filing, he did say that he will have as many shareholders in private Twitter as is allowed by law. And I have it that in America, the number of individuals that you can have owning a private company is 2,000. So he's one. And of the existing shareholders, he can ask them, or private equity players that he want to be associated with, he can ask them to help him bridge the equity gap. It's not like he must come up with the money himself. That's quite interesting to note. He's one, but he could still get assistance from 1,199 people. Right, that's it, guys. But also just remembering that this guy is worth however many billions. But he's the richest man of our time. But even for him, he doesn't have 21 billion in cash lying around because much of his wealth is in his Tesla stock. That's been a mouthful. But let's wrap it out with part 3. What happens next? It's very, very much important to note that Elon Musk hasn't bought Twitter. If we were to look at it in relationship terms, they engaged, but anything could still happen. The deal could still fall through for a number of reasons, but just some of the things that still need to happen, right? While the board has approved the takeover, the shareholders of Twitter must also vote on the matter. And this is now down to whether, if I was a shareholder of Twitter, do I believe that 54.2 is a fair value price for my shares? And here I will need to consider where I think Twitter is going, its earning potentials, and if one wants to buy it at this price, do I think it's actually going to be worth more at some point in time? That's the biggest thing that shareholders will need to consider, But if you look at the value of Twitter at this point in time, it's definitely worth way less than that $54 that he's offering for it. But ultimately, the shareholders need to decide how much valuable they think this company is worth. Secondly, with a handful of banks having expressed interest in funding, I think it's about 26 billion in debt facility, they will still need to go through their formal credit processes. And it could happen that, through going and trying to apply the corporate heads and legal heads to this, they realize that, they can't necessarily justify spending $54.20 to buy per share to buy Twitter, or to fund the acquisition of Twitter when it's currently worth way less than that. Banks are also about preserving value for shareholders, and at the same time, it's also about ensuring that the money that you put out is recoverable. So if I put out $54 for this company, for Twitter, a company that has only been profitable twice in the last 5 or 10 years, they need to consider that they are giving they're valuing Twitter at 54.20 per share when the share price is actually up, I think it's about 38% less than that. So how do they justify that? How do they get their big corporate heads around that? And how do they do it in a way that still comply with central banks, or reserve banks as we call them in South Africa? How are they going to justify this decision? And is it a decision that makes sense? Now, it is important to note, though, that even if banks can't raise the full money, Elon Musk will not be off the hook. So if the banks decide, or the bankers decide, listen, we can do this at, let's say, 50 Rand a share, so we have to reduce the money that we borrowed you. You will need to raise more in equity, or you need to contribute more from your equity side. Elon Musk wouldn't be off the hook due to him not being able to raise the money, the funding from the bank, because the announcement is made by Twitter is that there are no funding conditions. This approval by the board is not conditional on Elon Musk raising funding. Let's say it happens that he doesn't get the funds, and then he decides, okay, if I can't get all the money that I wanted from the bank, then I'm just going to back out. He will need to pay about $1 billion or 1.4 billion as a termination fee. So, I mean, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money, like 15 billion rands in South African money for changing your mind or for not being able to go through with the transaction because you couldn't raise funds for it. But also just to mention that, $1 billion is a lot of money for me and you, but it is only 0.5% of his wealth. Not even that, less than that. So serious money that people have. And then, the other thing, whilst we're talking about breaking up and potentially terminating this transaction before it happens, let's say that Twitter decided to go out because they don't really like Mr. Musk. They decided to go out and find another buyer that will be willing to pay more than what Elon Musk has proposed for this company, highly unlikely. Then they would have to then pay him the 1.4 billion as a termination fee for all the heartbreak and all the trouble that they would have cost him. Yo, guys, I feel like when you and I sit and think about what to buy, whether to buy a winter jacket or whether to buy a microphone or, I don't know, whether to buy a Big Mac, Elon Musk thinks of whether to spend $44 billion on Twitter. It's just the level of our toys or our understanding of playthings. It's just so different. What an impulse buy, a 44 billion rand impulse buy. I don't know. That's it for me, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned from this. I am definitely keeping an eye on this, but let me know what your thoughts are. What company are you buying this winter in 2022? What toy are you getting for yourself? As always, if you like this video, let me know in the comment section, and all of your comments, all of your thoughts. What do you think? Let's chat. Until next time, bye.